the Phillies finished 81-81. I mean, I don't know that you could script it any better for as average of a season this was. They'd win 2, they'd lose 2. They'd win 1, they'd lose 1. They never could get a streak going. They were a watermark high 10 games over 500, and from that point on, they were 10 games under 500. I mean, you can't make out how average and mediocre this team was, which was very disappointing to many. Was it disappointing enough to the ownership group that changes feel like they're coming? Well, Scott Lauber is around the team all season long from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he is with us now to kind of shake down some of the questions that need to be answered. And I know, Scott, everybody is wondering if the Phillies are going to act. Many teams have, the Cubs, the Pirates, the Angels. They've all made decisions. Is it ominous today or expected today that the Phillies did not make any irrational decisions or maybe somewhat rational decisions, depending on who you talk to?
Hey, Mike. Yeah, I think we're up to, 6 managerial openings now. The Padres, Pirates, Royals, Giants, Cubs, and today the Angels moving on from Brad Ausmus. A lot of people think that they made that move because they're going to take a run at Joe Maddon, who began his big league coaching career in Anaheim. Might be a real sensible fit for that team, for that market in Southern California. So everyone's wondering now whether the Phillies or the Mets are going to join the list of teams that are going to be looking for managers. And specifically here, obviously, we're interested in the Phillies. And I heard your intro there, and I think you're right. We didn't really get any kind of resolution or even a hint at a resolution after the final game of the season yesterday. And I myself, just in trying to figure out what they might be thinking, haven't had a whole lot of luck in terms of picking up too many signs. I mean, you try to read the tea leaves here and there, and a couple of things that I think I can say with some certainty. I think that the general manager, Matt Klentak, is very much in favor of keeping Gabe Kapler. He has said so publicly. Kapler was the first manager he got to hire. You got a feeling that if they fire Gabe Kapler, the next manager will probably be the last one Matt Klentak gets to hire. You don't get a whole lot of these if you're a general manager. And,
is that suggesting, Scott, not to cut you off real quick, is that suggesting that you think Klentak is safe?
I do. I think he is. I think to think otherwise would be ignoring that he signed a contract extension in the spring, and so if they were to turn around and fire him, they would not only be on the hook for, I think it's 3 more years to pay the guy, but also just it would be a pretty stark reversal, kind of about face. Ownership rewarded him after the winter with an extension, and I think to go fire him now would be a pretty like I said, kind of a pretty stark about face to sort of fall out of love with the general manager who you were in love with so much just this spring that you kept him. So I think he's safe. But, and I think that his recommendation to ownership is that, that Gabe Kapler be allowed to come back. I think that at least that's his recommendation. Matt Klentak has talked a lot about the injuries that they've had and that being the main reason for why they didn't achieve what everyone thought they would. And that's not that there's truth in that. It's not the whole story. It's certainly not the only reason. But it can't be ignored either what they lost throughout the course of the year. Does a full year of Andrew McCutchen and Jake Arrieta and a complete bullpen, does that make the difference between 81 wins and the 89 or 90 that they would have needed to make the playoffs? I don't know. I don't know if those players are an 8 or 9 win difference, but not having them certainly is a contributing factor. And I know that that's where Matt Klentak stands as far as, the thinking that the manager, did well with what he had and all of that. So now the question becomes, does ownership agree? And if they do, how are they going to sell this to a fan base that I think very much wants change? If not, just in the manager's seat than throughout the organization. So, I'm sure that there are some meetings that have gone on there today, and I think in a day or so we'll have a bit of more of a resolution as to what they want to do going forward.
Hey, Scott, it's Moshe. So here's my question then, because I also have struggled to reconcile the extension that Klentak got this year and then the idea that he might get fired. But I also, part of me feels that there's some Steinbrenner in Middleton. Part of me feels like he's an impulsive guy. He's certainly a guy willing to spend, and he seems to also have his ear to the fan base and, maybe in a good and a bad way, just like Steinbrenner did. So is it, in your experience in dealing with John, do you see that as well, or do contemporaries, other league executives that you speak to, do they ever give you that feeling that he's an unpredictable type who might be impulsive enough to make a firing, in the same year that he gave an extension?
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, I think, look, I wrote about this a week or so ago that, one thing we know about John Middleton is that he's listening. If he doesn't have, if he's not listening to this show right now, he is listening to a show probably right now, and he is very much in touch with the pulse of how the fans feel. He is at heart a fan. He's a fan who happens to have, a couple $1 billion and owns a team and, has the ability to make decisions that affect the team he roots for, but he's a fan, and he has a sense of Phillies history. He has a sense of baseball history. He enjoys that Steinbrenner comparison. I don't think he's anywhere near as impulsive as Steinbrenner. I don't think he's anywhere near as involved every day. I mean, the stories about how reporters used to hang out outside Yankee Stadium to wait for George to leave after every game because you never knew what he was going to say. John Middleton's not at that level of impulsive and not at that level of outrageous and not at that level of involved. But when he wants something, he certainly does get involved, and we saw him get very much involved in the Bryce Harper pursuit in spring training. We saw him get very involved in the hitting coach change 6 weeks ago. And, I'm sure he's involved in this decision about what to do about the manager. And I wrote this recently that, I feel like he would be wise to not make this decision based entirely on what he hears from the fans. I got a little spooked in spring training when I heard him bring up the, a Twitter poll that that Todd Zalecki put out from MLB.com about, who do you want, Machado or Harper? And it was overwhelmingly Harper. And he cited that Twitter poll when he, on the day that they signed Harper or the day after about, why they went that direction. And that was a little bit worrisome that he's got his ear to the ground that much that he's going to allow himself to be influenced that much. And the reason I wrote that in regards to Kapler is that I think from day one, Kapler was never the people's choice. He's been sort of, painted as not a Philly guy from day one, and he's very much not a Philly guy. He does not do anything like any manager in Philly's history has ever done before or probably will since. Doesn't look or sound or act like anyone that people here are familiar with. And, I think that fans have not wanted this guy from day one. So, of course, they want him to be not the guy. And, look, if they feel like they can get a better manager, they should switch managers. But they shouldn't do it just because they think that's what the people want. I think that would be a bad reason to make a decision on the manager.
Yeah, Scott, I read your article in the Inquirer. Phillies might fire Gabe Kapler, but did management deal him a fair hand? And I thought it was a really interesting read for anyone that has not read that. Go take a look at it at theinquirer.com because you kind of filter through everything this season that's transpired. And just to go back, July 12th, the Phillies are 47-43. They have a half-game lead in the second wild card spot. Andy McPhail comes out and says, we're not making a push. We're not making a deadline move. If we don't make the playoffs, we don't. And that was kind of a popular point in the season, turning point, you can say. Phillies don't add anyone. They get a lot of other teams' trash that they bring in here. They don't make the playoffs. And now 2 months later, we're talking about them firing Gabe Kapler. Are we focusing in on the wrong people, the wrong areas of concern? Is there a bigger issue here that you're looking at?
Well, look, I think that they're all all in the same boat, honestly. I think Gabe Kapler is an extension of the front office as much or even more maybe than most managers. I think he's what they wanted when they hired him. He's exactly the kind of manager that they wanted, and he's in philosophical lockstep in a lot of ways with Matt Klentak and the front office. And the point I was trying to make in that column, and I've thought a lot about that day when they came back from the All-Star break lately, because that if we don't comment has gotten so much attention, and it was really part of a larger answer to a question about what they were going to do with the deadline. And McPhail made it very clear, and Matt Klentak doubled down on it about a week or 10 days later, that they didn't view themselves as one trade away and from being a contender, and because of that they weren't going to trade Alec Boehm or Spencer Howard or Adam Hazley or Mickey Moniak. Those were the big four that they kind of drew a line out on and said, look, we're not going to move these guys because, look, if we were in this thing closer to the Braves and one move away from being a division champion, that'd be a different story. And they might have been right about that. They probably weren't at that point just one move away. They certainly weren't one move away. But they also did have, they were holding the wild card. They had a half a game lead on the Brewers. And I remember thinking at the time, for a team that hasn't made the playoffs since 2011, making the playoffs was not, even as a wild card, getting one wild card game, that was not something to just sort of discard. I mean, number one, you don't know when you're going to have that opportunity again. Let's say something happens early next season and you have a team that you like a lot, but Aaron Nola gets hurt or Bryce Harper gets hurt. I mean, you can't sort of chalk up a year and say, well, it wasn't our year. We'll do this next year, because you don't know what the future's going to hold. So there they are, a half a game up in the for the second wild card, and if you don't want to trade Alec Boehm or Spencer Howard, that's fine. But I thought they sort of sent the wrong message, especially to the clubhouse, that they didn't believe in the team maybe as much as some of the players in the room believed in them. And I've thought about it a lot in the last few days, because these are the people, McPhail and Klentak, who are going to be essentially making a decision on Gabe Kapler, or at least a recommendation about Gabe Kapler. And the reason to fire Gabe Kapler would be that you didn't make the playoffs this year. So if he's going to take the fall for not making the playoffs, ownership did sign off on the idea that they weren't going to go all out at the trade deadline in order to make the playoffs. And those are the people who are going to be picking the next manager if they fire Gabe Kapler. So there just didn't seem to be something, it seems like there are two different standards. And you sort of wonder, what was the organization's goal midway through the season, and does it line up with what Gabe Kapler might be taking the fall for?
Scott Lauber covers the Phillies for the Inquirer. He's with us here on the Sports Bash. Mike, Mosh, Ryan. Let me ask your opinion, Scott, of Gabe as a manager. I mean, a lot of people think that he's terrible. A lot of people think that he's not very good in game, that he cost them a lot of games. You're there every night. You also have a very good understanding that the game that we are watching as fans, our way that we watch a game is no longer the way that front offices want the game to be kind of played. So are we judging a guy not fairly? So in other words, is he a better manager than maybe the everyday fan gives him credit to be?
Well, I'm not someone who believes that a manager wins or loses too many games throughout the course of a season. I really don't. At least not with the moves he makes. In a game, did he leave his starter in too long? Did he bring in the right reliever? Did he pinch hit for a guy? I think those things tend to even out. And honestly, I don't know how much influence a manager exerts over the outcome of a game over the long course of a season. Did he win them some games? Probably. Did he lose them some games? Probably. Where I see a manager having the most influence is over a team is in the clubhouse, and being a leader and being a voice. He's very much a player's manager. We know that. I think that it's fair to wonder whether he handled some of the not hustling issues the right way. I think it started in San Diego with Segura on the play that McCutchen got hurt, and then a couple of weeks later, Segura did it again. And, there was no penalty for it. He was not pulled out of the game. He was not benched the next day. I think it's fair to wonder whether he handled things like that correctly and whether, he exerted, a heavier hand where at times where maybe he didn't do that and he could have. You talk to players and they seem to like playing for him. I think one of the reasons they like playing for him is that, they very much have a say in what's going on. I mean, he's, like I said, a player's manager, and he collaborates a lot with them, and he doesn't rule with an iron fist. And I think a lot of managers are that way these days. They seem to play hard for him. I thought they played, generally speaking, hard down the stretch, even if the results weren't very good. But, people have said to me, like, what do you think, some of the leaders of the team would say if Middleton called them in and said, what do you think of the manager? And my feeling has been, and I don't know this for sure, no one has said this to me flat out, but just the impression that I get is that they enjoy playing for him, but I don't know that they're going to necessarily stand on a chair and fight for him to stay either. I think that, if, they'd be fine with a change, they'd be fine if he stayed. And I think that some will fight harder than others. I know Rhys Hoskins really likes Gabe Kapler. He's, it's the manager he's played for the majority of his career. Some other guys in the room who've played for a lot of different managers and might be okay with a change. So I don't know. I'm not someone who thinks that in-game strategy is something that a manager is going to make or break your season. I think that you can always, I think certainly when a team underachieves, they could always use a different voice in the room. And maybe that's the reason why they'll, if they do this and they fire him, maybe that's their explanation, that they just wanted a different voice in that room. And Joe Madden might be a different voice. Joe Girardi certainly would be. Buck Showalter definitely would be. There are some people who are out there who could be hired who might bring a different perspective, and maybe that's what they want.
Obviously, this team has a lot of things they need to kind of pinpoint in the offseason. Everybody says pitching, and we know that's one area that they definitively need, more pitching, both starting and bullpen. But, Scott, what about the everyday lineup? Do they have to? They spent $400 million on that everyday lineup last year. Is there something that they need to fix even in the everyday lineup on top of all the pitching issues?
Well, probably. I mean, they were sort of an average, kind of league average offensive team. And that was the one part of the year that had me scratching my head because I didn't think they had enough pitching going into the season. I don't know too many people who did think they had enough pitching going into the season. And even before all the injuries, they didn't have enough pitching. So, no kidding, you got to go make a run at Garrett Cole. No kidding, you've got to rebuild your bullpen. These are things that are, smacking us in the face about this team. But why they didn't score more runs, I think, is the question they're going to have to ask themselves and try to figure out, try to get to the bottom of. I think most of us, when the season began, thought if they were going to make the playoffs, they were going to have to slug their way there. And they certainly didn't do that. So for all the shortcomings that we thought they were going to have with the rotation in the bullpen, especially with the rotation, and that they did have, and then all the shortcomings they wound up having with the bullpen because of all the injuries, they just didn't score enough runs to make the playoffs. And the two areas, if you want to look at different positions and where they could upgrade, certainly they could upgrade at third base. Certainly they could upgrade in center field. And, they're going to have to make some decisions about where does Scott Kingery play. They're going to have to make some decisions about whether Adam Hazley is a guy going forward that they think can be an everyday center fielder for them. What do you do about third base? Do you sort of bring in someone to kind of hold the place until Alec Bohm is ready, maybe middle of the year? Or do you go out and get a stud third baseman and, maybe move Alec Bohm in a trade or something like that? So these are a lot of decisions that are going to have to get made. And, this would be a lot easier for them if they could sit here at the end of the year and say, yeah, we know we were short with pitching and we'll address that. And they need to address that. But they were short offensively too. And, I don't know why or where or what the reason was, but they're going to have to get to the bottom of that.
All right, we'll leave you with the tough one, Scott. What does your gut say? Will Gabe Kapler be back in the dugout next year?
I don't think so. But again, I'm not totally willing to go there. I mean, I could very easily see them coming out in a day or two and talking about all the injuries they had and how they could have been, in the 88, 89 win range if all those guys were healthy. That's not something that's going to play very well with the public, and they're going to have to spin that pretty hard if that's the way they're going to do it. But I don't think that's beyond the pale. I think they could do that. I don't think they will. I think Middleton probably feels like a change needs to be made, and the manager with 1 year left on his contract is the easiest change to make. So given the names that are out there that they could go after, given the fact that he has only 1 year left, and given the fact that they underachieved, I think that he'll probably be the one to take the fall for that. That's kind of sort of the direction that I'm leaning if I had to predict.
All right, Scott. Real quick before we let you run, Rhys Hoskins, where do you stand there? I mean, I guess there has been some people that think they might try to lock him up to a long-term deal back at spring training. Maybe their thoughts on his future here has changed. What do you think his future looks like?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think he'll be here next year. I wrote about it the other day that he's this homegrown slugger, and we know how the Phillies, we know how most teams feel about their homegrown players. I think they'd rather tout him than trade him, and I think his first couple of years have been, for the most part, a triumph of their player development system. So I think they'll look at ways to get him to make him better. I think, like most things, they'll look into why the second half for him was so bad. But at the end of the day, I think they want to build around him. I don't think they want to use him in a trade. So I think he's here. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if his name comes up during the season because of his contract situation. He'd be a guy you could probably get something for. But I think they want to build around him still, and I think he's certainly a part of their nucleus going forward.
Scott Lauber with the Phillies season in the books, kind enough to join us here on the Sports Bash. And, of course, Scott Lauber, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. All right, busy offseason, Scott. Thanks so much, pal.
Sure, anytime, guys.